watching Germantown Municipal Television, your source for everything Germantown.
Welcome to Law Talk on Germantown Municipal Television. I am Vince Perryman, and I am a local attorney with the law offices of J. Vincent Perryman. Each month, Law Talk focuses on a wide range of legal issues and topics. On today's show, we'll discuss employment law. With us now is attorney Maureen Holland. Maureen, thanks for being with us.
Oh, thanks, Vince. I'm so glad to be here today.
Yeah, so, I get calls all the time where people say, I need a labor lawyer. And I'm like, I don't think you're talking about a union, and I don't think you're the employer. So this falls under the broad category of employment law, which most people are like, what's that mean exactly?
I think that's a great question. Employment law in its basic element, if you will, is law that relates to problems on the job.
Okay.
And those problems can fall into any number of subcategories. And there are lawyers who specialize in those subcategories, and there are lawyers who cover sort of a broader range of legal issues and legal problems for job issues. And I do with Holland and Associates PC, our firm in Midtown, where I'm fortunate enough to work with a junior partner who happens to be my daughter. And our little boutique shop, if you will, we represent employees on employee rights issues, but it covers employment law, in discrimination or some wage issues, just generalized problems in the workplace that have a legal feel or a legal piece to them. And most of the time, just calling a lawyer who does employment law, they can help you sort out whether or not that's the right lawyer for you, whether or not there's a subspecialty type of lawyer that would be better. And that's kind of how it starts.
Okay, yeah, and as far as what are some examples of the issues, and who are you before a court, or are you before an administrative body, or?
Yeah, so there's so many different kinds and so many different areas that an employment lawyer might be a part of or help an employee with. Our side is really helping employees. So there are two main sides to an employment problem. The employee and the employer are having a difficulty, and there are lawyers who predominantly represent the employees, and there are lawyers that predominantly represent the employer. We represent the employees. So when an employee comes to us and they say, hey, I'm having a problem, that problem could be the type of a problem where they need a lawyer to explain the law, and there may be things that that employee can do with their current employer. So the lawyer doesn't have to go to court or doesn't have to go in front of some other administrative body. It could be the kind of a problem where the solution is going to take the employee to a court. It might be a state court, it might be a federal court, it might be either court, it might be both courts. That's why it's really helpful to have a lawyer. There are types of problems that are going to bring the employee in front of an administrative body, so an administrative judge, or perhaps even a group of lay people who have to make decisions. And so those type of administrative bodies who help solve employment problems, to know, hey, do I need to go to there? Where do I need to go? It's really helpful to talk to an employment lawyer, because I can help you and help the employee sort out where to go. Who is going to help solve this problem?
Yeah, it's almost like having a guide through a choose-your-own-adventure book.
Exactly. Well, that's exactly right. I think so often nowadays, because of the complexity of employment law, because of the wide array of solutions that might be available, it's really helpful to have an employment lawyer guide you through this process. And so most of the time, we're really a guide from the beginning of the process through to the end of the process. And the challenge for employees is, how do you go about finding these lawyers? And I think that's really the biggest challenge right now, because usually you have to contact a bar association and you can find out about us, or you can call your lawyer friend that you know and they might know something about the people who do employment law. But most of the bar associations, the organizations that locally provide education and training to lawyers, they have groups that are designated as employment law lawyers, and usually you can find them through that process.
Okay, yeah, and that's always been kind of interesting, because people, sometimes when you get these calls from folks, I know when we get them in our office, it's one that fleshing out exactly what they think their problem is, to figure out which side they're on and this and that, and where to kind of guide them in the direction. It's always interesting, because not everything that happens to an employee leads to a claim.
That's right. I mean, really the vast majority of employment problems are solved with information from a lawyer about what your rights are, information from a lawyer about what process you can follow that's not a lawsuit, another process that you can follow that might be far less expensive and much quicker to solve the problem. And then in the rare instances where you need to go to a lawsuit, the lawyer can help direct you in what court to go to, what choice of court, what types of claims you might have. And all of that is really something that an employment lawyer does and helps you sort through the process.
And I would think in some of those situations, it's simply explaining to the person, well, you don't have enough yet, but you need to continue to document.
That's really the first step of solving an employment problem. It's not always about going to court, but even in trying to solve the most basic employment problem of, I feel that I am being targeted, for instance, by my supervisor or by a coworker, and I feel that that's not appropriate. It's really hard if 6 months go by or a year goes by and you have no clear documentation of when the problems happened, how often the problems happened, how severe the problems are. So that kind of basic documentation can be really helpful in helping a lawyer sort through with you, with the employee, what the options are, how to help solve the employment problem.
And I think there's also the issue there too of who all you've notified if there's a requirement in whatever handbook, manual, employee type paperwork there is.
So, and you may raise a really important point. So often in employment law, if you do go down the process of having to go to a trial because there's no other immediate solution, sometimes your employer that you're working for has a defense, that is, they can block the lawsuit from progressing because the employee didn't follow the process set out in a handbook. Now, there are always exceptions. But for the most part, many companies now have a handbook. And that handbook doesn't necessarily create a binding contract between the employee and the employer. It's more of a set of guidelines that the employee needs to pay attention to, because it might impact whether or not they're going to be blocked in the future from the chance to get their problem solved in the court system. So it's really important to document, and it's really important to know if you have a handbook and what that handbook says about problem solving. And usually those handbooks have categories of types of problems. So, for instance, the category might say
those
harassment.
Categories will be a great place to pick up when we come back. We got to take a break right now. Please stay with us, and we'll have more discussion on employment law when we come back.
Don't worry, 74 people were picked before me in the NFL draft.
To fight childhood obesity, United Way and the NFL are helping kids play at least 60 minutes a day.
Okay, time for the team obstacle course. Yay!
What this place needs is more healthy kids. To get involved or donate, go to unitedway.org/play60.
Now I get it.
You are watching Germantown Municipal Television, your source for everything Germantown.
Welcome back. I'm Vince Perryman, and you're watching Law Talk. Joining us on our show today is attorney Maureen Holland, and we're discussing employment law. Maureen, before the break, we were talking about employee handbooks, and you were just about to start going through a list of things that might be addressed in an employee handbook that are employment issues.
So it's really helpful when you're having an employment problem to first find out, as I'd mentioned, whether your company has a handbook. And if it does, that can be a real advantage, because probably in the front of that handbook is an index. And that index is sort of like a directory of types of problems. And if you can find your category, so for instance, you feel that you're being harassed on the job, there's probably a harassment policy. And you can go to that policy then and read up on what the rules are for working with your employer and how it is that you can go about then dealing with your employer, following a process if you feel you're being harassed. And that's a really important starting point. But there are so many other nuances to that, so many other pieces to that, that it makes it valuable once you know that information, for instance, of harassment, to then talk to an employment lawyer who can give you the additional information that might be valuable to you in solving your harassment problem.
Yeah, because I would say probably the handbook gives you a guideline, but it's not going to tell you the same amount of information that somebody who's your advocate's going to.
Right. I mean, the employment law has become so specialized that even lawyers who don't do employment law often and are well advised to refer employee problems to an employment lawyer. It's that specialized, because you can read it in the handbook, you can look it up online, you can read about it in the newspaper, and still what isn't available is how those rules or the law applies to the specific nuanced facts of any specific employee's problem. So putting all of those pieces together and sort of creating a tailored solution for each employee is really what is going on with employment law now, and that often entails the advice of an expert, someone who really focuses on employment law.
So in general on this, what are the, because you'd have the handbooks that kind of give you some guidance in there from the employer, and then what else would there be out there that would be like the rules and regulations of employment?
So in addition to these policies that a company might have, there are state laws and federal laws, and those laws are going to be the most important, because policies often are not enforceable by you're suing your company for, hey, you have a policy and you didn't follow it. Many of those policies are just guidelines and not legally enforceable by an employee. So behind those type of rules, there are laws. And the state laws, there are many that address many different categories of employment problems. And then there are federal laws, of which there may be many, that address different types of employment problems. And knowing which law and each of these laws, I should say, have different timelines. So if you want to pursue a problem and a solution to a problem, and you have a rule with your company or a policy, and then you find out that there's a state law that also protects you, that state law is going to have any number of deadlines that you have to meet in order to be able to use that state law to help you. The federal system is going to have federal timelines that you're going to need to follow in order for the federal laws to help you. And often those timelines are not the same. And they may overlap, they may not overlap. It just all depends on the timing, the timing of the problem, the type of problem, and understanding that and understanding those twists and turns is really one of the reasons why employment lawyers are so busy and why our phones are ringing, because it's really important to know that information if you are trying to solve an employment problem.
Yeah, and I think the thing when we're talking about time limits and statute limitations or whatever somebody calls that,
Right.
the hardest thing that I have in the tax world on statute limitations is figuring out when it started running.
Yes.
And that's something that an individual who has no legal knowledge in that area is not going to be able to do, and that's why it's so important to come to somebody like you, because that way you can say, well, it started running at this date, not the date that you thought it ran at, and we're right up on the statute, we're past it, that sort of thing.
It's a challenge because so often with employment problems, for instance, one of the sad things that can happen with an employment problem is that an employee is wrongfully terminated. And if that were to happen, the employee is usually trying to find money to live on, pay their transportation expenses, pay their housing expenses, deal with their food, and those issues end up taking a great deal of time. And sort of put in the back are the employment piece. What about that termination was wrongful? What can I do to solve that? But those also have timelines that start running right away and often start running before your actual termination. So there are times when an employee, for instance, might have been told they're going to be terminated. Hey, you're going to be terminated in 2 weeks. So that knowledge, that time that they were told might be the starting time for their problem. And if that's the starting time, that's obviously earlier than the termination date. And each day that goes by is one less day to get your problem going in the legal system, and that can be very important. There are also other things that can affect timelines. Some employees, when they apply to a job or they accept a job, have agreed in writing that they have a shorter timeline than is otherwise available under the law. And the employee might not even remember that they signed that, and so it's really helpful to go to an employment lawyer quickly, because that employee might have a much shorter timeline than is normally available to somebody else who was wrongfully terminated, for instance. And these timelines, though, keep going, keep ticking, even if maybe the employee's taking or former employee's taking certain steps. It doesn't mean that those steps are stopping those timelines.
Right.
And sometimes certain steps, some filing, if you will, going to an administrative agency may allow a timeline to stop temporarily while that agency looks into the problem. But sometimes even going to an agency doesn't stop the legal timeline for filing a lawsuit. And knowing that and knowing how to walk through that process can be really important, an important factor in knowing to go to an employment lawyer.
And that's an excellent point and a good place for us to stop for a break here. When we return from our break, we'll talk more with Maureen Holland about employment law.
So they say it's a man's world? I don't see anybody's name on it.
While they were doing their thing, we slowly changed all that.
Today, women can do anything men can do. And there's one thing we're even better at.
Looks like it's done.
Don't let salmonella get funky with your chicken. On average, 1 in 6 Americans will get a foodborne illness this year. You can't see these microbes, but they might be there. So learn the right temperature to cook each type of meat. Keep your family safe at foodsafety.gov.
You are watching Germantown Municipal Television, your source for everything Germantown.
Welcome back. With us now is attorney Maureen Holland, and we're talking about employment law. Maureen, before the break, we were talking about the statute of limitations and how the timelines matter. And I think the real thrust of that is as soon as you think you've got an employment problem, you need to go talk to an employment lawyer.
Yes. And, you know, if you can afford one, you should go and talk. Most employment lawyers do charge for their consultations. And if you can't afford a lawyer, there are legal clinics held around the city that you should go to as soon as possible. If you believe you have a discrimination claim, you might want to go and talk to an administrative agency like the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, where you can go in and walk in and you don't have to have talked to a lawyer first. But it may be helpful to talk to a lawyer because it might make your documents better. But if you need to and you're concerned about your time frame, that's an important avenue also. And a lot of different employees have different timelines. For instance, if you're a federal employee and you're working for a federal agency and you believe you're having a problem because you're feeling targeted because you're a minority, for instance, or because you're a woman, your time frame to go and complain might be 45 days. If you work for a company, though, exact same scenario, your time frame in Tennessee might be 300 days. So this variation on timeline, is it 45 days? There's some that maybe are 180 days. All of these days are continuing day by day, right? That number is clicking off, and so it's really important to talk to an employment lawyer as soon as possible. Sadly, I've seen a number of people with very good cases that could not pursue their cases because it was too late. And the courts, there's a rule in law that you're presumed to know the law even if you don't actually know the law. So even if you personally as an employee are not familiar with the timeline, the law is going to impose on you, the court system is going to impose on you that you already know the timelines. So that's why it's really important to go and talk to a lawyer as soon as possible and get good advice. Find out what your timelines are. Find out what avenues are available for you to solve the problem. And more likely than not, go before you're fired. Go when you feel you're having a problem. So often we're able to help individuals and employees stay employed because there are ways to handle on-the-job problems that perhaps the employee wasn't aware of. And that can be really helpful in having the employee's goals met of being gainfully employed, or even staying with a company that they really love and they want to support.
Yeah, it makes me think of a federal law enforcement officer that was medically disqualified the day before the medical results came out by HR, and it's kind of like, this is interesting timing here. And it was probably one of those cases where there was only 45 days to object or whatever, but you know, so you see these things.
You do, and I see these things which are very sad to me because many times those particular problems tend to have been very severe. And there's nothing I can do except explain the law, which is helpful, but doesn't feel as good as getting some other compensation really for the problems that you had to suffer as a former employee. So it's really important to get that advice. It's really important to talk to somebody who is an employment lawyer. Certainly, if you have a friend who does tax law or does family law, talk to them and get a referral right away. I think you'll find it much more helpful.
Yeah, and I think some people, because I've run into this a few times where somebody's having a problem employment-wise and they went and talked to the HR department and they were like, well, I guess I don't have anything, because they just trust the employer's human resources department. I'm kind of like, they don't work for you, you know?
Right, HR works for the employer. They're supposed to be giving information, but certainly their loyalty is to the employer. And if you want to know what your rights are as an employee, it's good to talk to your own lawyer and figure that out. You know, oftentimes I'm asked, what is it I get when I go to, you know, an employment lawyer who might charge for their time? What's going to happen during that meeting? And the answer really is that the lawyer should go through with you as an employee what's going on, should figure out and help figure out what categories of legal categories are involved, should give you the law as it relates to those categories, and should come up with you as an employee for how you like to solve problems, a game plan, maybe even an ABC game plan of ways in which to address the legal problem. And that takes time. That is not a simple 5-minute conversation. So often, you know, my consults are at least an hour, a solid hour. I often go a little bit over because it's so intense, to provide that level of insight and guidance to an employee or a former employee for a company.
Yeah, and I think that's it gets back to the old adage of an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure.
It is. And it's so helpful because nowadays there are a lot of documents that employers are having employees sign. There are documents, if you want to be an employee, where you've agreed to go to arbitration if there's a problem. That's to a private judge, if you will. And there are all kinds of rules and a specific process for dealing with an arbitration. And maybe it's really helpful for you to know as an employee or former employee how that arbitration process works. Sometimes when you're employed, the employer is having you sign a document called a non-compete. And even though you've signed it, maybe it's enforceable, maybe it's not enforceable, or maybe only part of it is enforceable. And getting that kind of advice when you have to go out and find a job and you're worried, am I constrained by this non-compete? That kind of advice can be really helpful.
Yeah, and I think it's a good spot to wrap up here, because what we've got with that is on these non-competes, everybody's like, well, there's hard and fast rules, right? No, it depends on the industry, it depends on the region you're in, it depends on so many things. And it's not this isn't pocket knowledge that the average American worker is going to be carrying around with them. It's where somebody that does what you do is going to know what those cases are that has come out and everything. And that's why it's important to go, that's what you're paying for, is that expertise and that knowledge. So we thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
And our time is up for this edition of Law Talk. I'd like to thank our guests for being with us and sharing your thoughts and insights. If you'd like more information about Law Talk or any other program on Germantown Municipal Television, please refer to our website at www.gmtvonline.org. Thank you for joining us today, and be sure to join us next month for more legal topics. Until then, I am Vince Perryman, and thank you for watching.